Before the Black Death became a synonym for collapse, the world it entered looked, to the people living inside it, unnervingly durable. The Mongol Empire had stitched together enormous stretches of Eurasia into a commercial zone wider than any Christian king or Italian merchant banker could have imagined a century earlier. Caravans crossed the steppe. Brokers priced silk, spices, furs, and grain across languages and religions. Genoese and Venetian merchants moved through the Black Sea like men who believed distance itself had finally been conquered. Ports counted customs revenue. Princes counted tribute. Monasteries counted rents. Notaries counted obligations in ink lines so neat they gave the impression that disorder had been beaten into arithmetic. A world of ledgers and convoy routes had learned to feel permanent. And that is what makes the story so dangerous to tell badly. Because when later generations explain the Black Death, they often begin at the moment of horror, at the ships, the corpses, the sudden stench of mass death in Mediterranean streets. They begin when the empire is already cracking. But the real beginning is harder to film and less flattering to human pride. It lies in the quiet confidence of a system that believed trade was control, that movement was mastery, that the road could enrich without ever betraying its users. For a while, that confidence looked justified. Then, somewhere upstream of Europe's panic, something crossed from an animal reservoir into a human network, and one of the richest connected worlds on Earth discovered that integration has a price. Sometimes it is paid in coin, sometimes in blood, sometimes in both. If there is one object that can carry the weight of this entire story, it is not a royal decree or a papal warning. It is a tombstone. A weathered stone from a cemetery near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan, inscribed in Syriac, dated 1338, and marked with a word that translates, with terrible simplicity, as pestilence. For more than a century, those stones sat at the edge of historical argument like evidence nobody quite knew how to cash. Were they connected to the Black Death, or merely to some other local outbreak now lost to time? Why did an obscure trading community in the Tian Shan foothills seem to experience a lethal surge of deaths just 8 years before plague erupted in Crimea, and then tore through Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa? And how did one quiet graveyard, far from London or Florence or Paris, end up holding the key to the most infamous pandemic in medieval history? To see why that question matters, it helps to measure the scale of what followed. Encyclopedia Britannica still gives the rough old benchmark familiar to generations of readers. About 25 million dead in Europe between 1347 and 1351. Other historians and syntheses push the number higher when they widen the frame beyond Europe alone. Philip Slavin, writing with Maria Spyrou and others, notes that the first wave of the second plague pandemic killed something like 50 to 60% of the population across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Net's economic survey gives an older but still useful estimate of 17 to 28 million deaths for Europe, while stressing just how violently mortality rates varied by place, class, and record set. The point is not to settle on a single sacred number. The point is that whatever number one prefers, the Black Death was not a bad decade. It was a demographic detonation. That detonation was not evenly distributed, which made it even more destabilizing. Net summarizes regional mortality in ways that still feel almost impossible to absorb. Languedoc may have lost 40 to 50% of its people. Tuscany, in some estimates, 60 to 80%. Urban death rates could be worse. Half the population in places like Siena, Orvieto, and Volterra. 50 to 66% in Hamburg. 58 to 68% in Perpignan. 70% in Bremen. Even within the same lordship, death could look arbitrary, with one Durham Cathedral Priory manor losing around 21%, while another lost 78%. That matters because markets can absorb pain. They cannot easily absorb randomness. A system can price known risk. It has a much harder time pricing a catastrophe that wipes out one village, spares the next, empties one workshop, devastates one monastery, and then returns before anyone has even finished the first set of wills. And the economic consequences came with equal violence. In England, wages rose by roughly 12 to 28% from the 1340s to the 1350s, and around 20 to 40% from the 1340s to the 1360s, because labor had become brutally scarce. The income of English lords contracted by about 20% between 1347 and 1353. Land went untilled. Tenancies failed. Entire assumptions about service obligations and manorial control suddenly looked negotiable. It is tempting, from a comfortable distance, to call that a redistribution. It was, but redistribution achieved by mass mortality is not progress. It is a transfer written by death itself, enforced not by reformers but by graves. The political institutions understood the threat immediately. When labor becomes rare, labor becomes expensive. When labor becomes expensive, elites rediscover the language of emergency. In England, the state tried to cap wages and tie workers back to pre-plague expectations. In Catalonia, as economic historians note, nobles held on more successfully because pre-existing structures of coercion were already stronger, and the agricultural system differed from places where domain labor was crucial. Elsewhere, landlords had to yield, bargain, or fail. So the plague was not merely a health event. It was a balance sheet event, a bargaining power event, a property rights event. It rearranged what work cost, what obedience cost, what land was worth, and what governments were willing to do to stop a labor market from discovering its own leverage. This is why the origin story matters so much. If one begins with medieval Europe choking on its own dead, the Black Death looks like a nightmare that arrived from outside history, a bolt from the biological blue. But if one traces it backward through trade arteries, political frontiers, and ecological zones, it becomes a story about how wealth systems connect themselves to landscapes they do not understand. The pandemic entered the Mediterranean in 1347 on ships linked to Black Sea trade. That much has long been clear. What was never clear was where, precisely, the chain truly began, and what the old answers were really built on. Zors, for centuries, one of the most influential anchors of that old story, was a dramatic account associated with the siege of Caffa in Crimea. In the popular version, Mongol forces besieging the Genoese city were struck by plague and hurled infected corpses over the walls, turning military desperation into one of history's earliest episodes of biological warfare. Survivors then fled by ship, carrying plague into the Mediterranean. It is a perfect story for television. It has empire, siege warfare, maritime capitalism, and grotesque spectacle. It also has a powerful villain. Other people over there breaching civilization with infected flesh, which is precisely why it lodged so deeply in the historical imagination. The man most associated with that story was Gabriel de Mussy, a notary from Piacenza. And he is worth pausing over because he tells us something important about how history hardens around narrative. De Mussy was not a physician or a general. He was a legal man, a man of forms, a man trained to render chaos into text with enough authority to make it usable. In a commercial society, that is no small power. Notaries made transactions durable. They turned promises into instruments. They were, in a sense, the engineers of trust. De Mussy belonged to a class of men whose words could move property and settle disputes long after the speakers themselves were gone. When such a man described catastrophe, later readers listened, and what he gave them was unforgettable. A world punished, an Eastern army collapsing under disease, corpses weaponized against a port, flight, contagion, divine terror. The CDC's review of his narrative is careful. His account is probably second-hand and uncorroborated in crucial respects, though not therefore worthless. He may have had access to eyewitnesses, and the episode he described is plausible within medieval siege practice. But even that review concludes that de Mussy was probably mistaken if one treats Caffa as the singular gateway through which plague entered Europe. Other Crimean ports mattered. Overland caravan routes mattered. The siege, for all its grim theatrical power, was probably anecdotal in the larger spread. A memorable scene is not the same as a full explanation. That, in a way, is the first thing historians got wrong, or rather the first thing popular history got wrong while blaming historians for the simplification. It mistook the most cinematic surviving account for the decisive origin. Caffa may have been part of the transmission story. It was not necessarily the beginning of the plague's line of descent, and it was certainly not the only corridor through which infection could move. The Black Sea was not a funnel with one opening. It was a mesh of ports, merchant houses, storage depots, caravan links, and political jurisdictions. Disease does not need a single heroic entrance when infrastructure has already been built for it. Imagine that reality on the ground. Outside the walls of Caffa, the forces of the Golden Horde. Inside, Genoese merchants whose fortunes depended on movement. Warehouses still full of goods that had taken months, sometimes years, to reach the coast. Credit tied up in cargo. Obligations tied up in departures. Sailors who knew delay could ruin a season. Investors who understood perfectly well that a ship sitting idle is not just a ship sitting still. It is money refusing to turn over. When plague appears in a system like that, the decision is never simply medical. It is contractual, political, psychological. At what point do men admit that the root which made them rich has become the root that will kill them? At what point do they stop calling the danger temporary because the alternative is writing off the voyage? No surviving clerk gives us the exact words spoken in those rooms, but the structure of the dilemma is obvious. Close the port and merchants suffocate themselves. Keep trade moving, and they gamble that the thing killing other people will not choose them next. There is a dry irony here. Medieval Eurasia had spent generations making long-distance exchange more reliable, more profitable, and more routine. The very success of that project meant that, by the 1340s, no one needed to invent an extraordinary route for plague. Ordinary commerce was enough. The system was already optimized for circulation. So was the pathogen. Still, Caffa is not where this story properly starts. The better beginning lies further east and slightly earlier, not in a moment of spectacle but in a problem of evidence. The academic Chinese origin theory for the Black Death had deep roots. Philip Slavin notes that learned arguments placing the pandemic's cradle somewhere in the east overlapping Central Asia. Mongolia and China go back centuries, and later historians proposed alternatives ranging from Iraq and the Caucasus to the Volga, the Urals, Western Siberia, the Gobi, and India. One reason the debate endured so long is simple. There was no securely dated ancient DNA from the crucial zone that could pin the disaster down. There were texts, probabilities, and broad ecological hunches. There was no equivalent of a signed confession. Then came the tombstones. The first part of that subplot began in the 19th century, when Russian excavations at the cemeteries of Kyrgyzstan and Burana in the Chui Valley uncovered an odd cluster of graves. Out of hundreds of stones spanning nearly a century, an unusually large number were dated to 1338. Several of the longer inscriptions named pestilence as the cause of death. Scholars argued over them for generations. Were they relevant to the European Black Death? Were they evidence of plague at all? Or were later readers simply romanticizing an isolated local tragedy because they wanted a dramatic prelude to Europe's better documented catastrophe? The second part began much later, when historian Philip Slavin revisited those records and realized that the chronology was almost too suggestive to ignore. A suspicious mortality spike in 1338 and 1339. A trading community near Lake Issyk-Kul, a date just 7 or 8 years before plague appears in Crimea, and then races across western Eurasia. It was the sort of clue historians live for and distrust in equal measure. Too neat, perhaps, too convenient, but also too specific to dismiss. This is where modern science enters a medieval story without flattening it. Working with Maria Spyrou and a multidisciplinary team, researchers obtained remains from 7 individuals buried in those plague year contexts. They sampled teeth, because blood-borne pathogens often leave their traces there most reliably. From those samples, they detected Yersinia pestis in 3 individuals and reconstructed 2 full genomes from the 1338-1339 outbreak. That alone would have been an extraordinary result. It confirmed that the mysterious pestilence named on the stones was, in fact, plague. But the deeper finding was even more important. Those genomes sat at the ancestral node just before the major diversification event, the so-called Big Bang or Great Polytomy, from which the later Black Death lineages emerged. In plain language, the team had found the source strain on the eve of the pandemic's explosive expansion. That is the moment the two stories collide. On one side, the old dramatic tale, plague bursts into European awareness at the siege of Caffa, perhaps from China in some vague civilizational distance, then advances west on cursed ships. On the other, a quieter and far more precise reconstruction. A 1330-1339 plague outbreak in the wider Tian Shan region, near Lake Issyk-Kul, linked by ancient DNA to the ancestral strain that preceded the pandemic's later diversification. The old story was vivid. The new one is sharper, and sharpness matters. The Max Planck team's public explanation is admirably restrained. They do not claim that Kyrgyzstan itself was the single point where the entire pandemic was born. They claim something slightly less cinematic and much more convincing, that the evidence is consistent with a local emergence of the ancestral strain within the extended Tian Shan region. Modern strains most closely related to the ancient genomes are found today in plague reservoirs around the Tian Shan Mountains. In other words, the most likely source was not some abstract East or a dramatic military set piece, but an ecological reservoir in Central Asia, close to where the 1338 outbreak occurred. Plague, after all, is not fundamentally a human disease. Humans are the interruption. Rodents are the long continuity. That last point is the second major thing people get wrong. They ask where the Black Death came from as if they are asking where an army came from. Which city? Which ruler? Which caravan? Which ship? But plague is not an army. It does not originate in a palace or a harbor office. It persists in animal populations and ecological niches, then crosses over when conditions allow. The human story matters enormously because humans build the highways down which disease moves. Yet the deepest origin lies in a reservoir, not a throne room. The outbreak that becomes famous in Europe may simply be the first moment European records become loud enough for later readers to hear. And this is where another historian, Monica Green, becomes important. Before the 2022 Nature paper, Green had already been arguing that the story of the Black Death might have to be widened both chronologically and geographically. In her work on the 4 Black Deaths, she pushed against the neat assumption that the pandemic was basically a short European event beginning in the 1340s. Drawing together genetics and textual evidence, she suggested that plague may have been spreading across Asia much earlier, perhaps from the 13th century onward, before reaching its most catastrophic Western crisis. The Smithsonian's summary of her work captures the caution built into the argument. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That matters because the new genetic evidence does not crush every earlier line of inquiry beneath one triumphant conclusion. It does, however, decisively narrow one question that had remained notoriously slippery: the spatio-temporal origin of the Black Death's source strain. Philip Slavin, writing in The Conversation, went so far as to say the publication ended the centuries-old debate over the where and when of the Black Death's beginnings. That wording is bold, perhaps deliberately so. Yet even there the argument is not that every root, every precursor outbreak, every ecological step is now fully known. It is that the old vague answers have been replaced by a much tighter one. The wider Tian Shan region, around 1330–1339, not a generic China and not merely Caffa. Now consider what that means in financial historical terms. The deadliest pandemic in medieval Western memory did not begin at the center of some imperial court. It began, or at least entered its decisive human phase, in a trading community on the margins of empires, at the meeting point of ecology and commerce. That is almost always where the real story hides, not in capitals proclaiming order but in corridors where value moves faster than supervision. Lake Issyk-Kul was not London. Kyrgyzstan was not Paris. But the world economy of the 14th century did not need the center's permission to become vulnerable. It only needed connectivity. From there, the consequences were immense and strangely double-edged. Labor scarcity meant survivors in some regions could command better terms. Serfs negotiated, fled, resisted, or simply discovered that a landlord with half his workforce buried has fewer options than he did before. Real wages rose. Land values changed. Marginal acreage could be abandoned. Diets sometimes improved for those still alive. The plague has therefore tempted some writers into grimly efficient formulations, as though a continent had merely undergone a correction. One hears in respectable language that the Black Death accelerated the decline of manorialism, weakened old feudal constraints, and raised per capita incomes. All true in part. All cold comfort if one remembers what paid for those outcomes. What paid was the body count, and not only the body count. Trust paid too, municipal life paid, clerical continuity paid, family firms paid, local memory paid. When a town loses half its people, it does not simply lose labor. It loses apprentices before mastery, widows before remarriage, fathers before instruction, priests before replacement, creditors before settlement, tenants before harvest, scribes before archives. The visible economy shudders. The invisible economy, the habits, expectations, and competencies that let a society reproduce itself, shudders even more. And downstream from that came coercion. The state does not usually observe a labor shortage with philosophical detachment. In England, legislation like the Ordinance and Statute of Laborers attempted to freeze wages and movement close to pre-plague norms. That was not nostalgia. It was class policy. The market had tilted toward workers because mortality had destroyed the labor supply, and ruling institutions attempted to reverse that by law. One can read those statutes as early labor regulation if one is feeling abstract, or one can read them more honestly as elite panic translated into enforcement. The dead had altered bargaining power. The living powerful tried to correct the dead. There were other costs, uglier still. Scapegoating followed fear with nauseating speed. Jewish communities across Europe faced massacres, expulsions, and accusations of well poisoning, because epidemics do not merely expose biological vulnerability. They expose the moral instincts of frightened societies. The plague did not invent anti-Jewish hatred. It gave it a fresh theater. And once again, the search for a human culprit proved emotionally easier than the acceptance of an ecological one. People prefer stories in which somebody chose the disaster. Reservoirs are much less satisfying villains. The long-term picture, then, is not one of simple collapse or simple renewal. It is a map of uneven transformation. Some elites lost income and control. Some peasants gained room to maneuver. Some regions restructured agriculture. Others hardened coercion. Cities recovered at different speeds. Political authority sometimes weakened, sometimes adapted. Even the disease itself did not vanish after its first spectacular wave. The second plague pandemic would recur for centuries. What arrived in the 1340s was not a single storm. It was the opening shock of a system change. And that returns us to the contradiction at the heart of the whole story. The most connected commercial world of its age mistook connection for command. The Mongol order had lowered transaction costs across Eurasia. Merchant republics had made distant trade habitual. Port cities had specialized. Brokers and rulers had learned to think in wider geographic scales. Yet all of that expansion also meant that a pathogen rooted in wild rodent ecologies could, once it crossed the threshold into human circulation, inherit the roads of empire for free. The same networks that made exchange prosperous also made contagion scalable. Civilization had built itself a distribution system. It did not know how to quarantine. So when someone says the Black Death came from China, or from Caffa, or from the Mongols, one should hear the partial truth and the larger failure. China, in these older formulations, often functioned less as an evidence-based origin than as a vague destination for European imagination. Far away, wealthy, mysterious, useful as a directional placeholder. Caffa, likewise, functioned as a narrative compression device, reducing a continental process to one unforgettable scene. The Mongols, meanwhile, can become an all-purpose carrier explanation, as if imperial expansion itself were the pathogen. But the genetic and historical evidence now suggests a narrower and more disciplined answer. The source strain most likely emerged in the wider Tian Shan region of central Eurasia, from a local plague reservoir, and the 1339 outbreak near Lake Issyk-Kul sits right on the threshold of the pandemic's later diversification. The old story was not wholly false. It was just too coarse. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where popular history turns tabloid. A corrected origin story is not proof that earlier historians were fools, liars, or members of some academic cartel protecting a false narrative. They were working with the evidence they had. Some leaned too hard on dramatic sources. Some spoke too vaguely about the East. Some were simply overtaken by better tools. That is not scandal. That is how scholarship works when new evidence arrives. And even now, caution matters. The 2022 findings do not mean every question is closed. Monica Green's broader arguments about earlier plague circulation in Asia still matter for the larger history of the pandemic. The source strain's origin is not identical to every transmission route it later used, and the route into Europe was almost certainly more plural than a single shipload of refugees. The better distinction is this. There are at least three different questions that people often bundle together and then call the origin of the Black Death. First, where did the ancestral strain associated with the pandemic emerge? The new answer points to the wider Tian Shan region around 1339. Second, through which routes did plague move into the Mediterranean and then across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa? There the answer remains a web of maritime and overland links, not one theatrical episode. Third, why did that spread become socially and economically so devastating? There the answer lies in demography, institutions, ecology, urban density, trade networks, labor systems, and human reactions ranging from denial to violence. Blend those questions carelessly, and one gets myth. Separate them, and history starts to breathe again. There is also a humbling methodological lesson. For all the chronicles, tax rolls, legal records, and sermons Europe preserved, one of the decisive clues came not from a famous archive in Rome or Venice, but from graves on the edge of the steppe, read across disciplines by archaeologists, historians, and geneticists willing to treat a tombstone and a tooth as equal partners in evidence. That is not a romantic flourish. It is a warning to any civilization that mistakes documentation for omniscience. The archive is never the world. It is only the part of the world that survived in forms we know how to read. And maybe that is why the true origin of the Black Death feels so unsettling once the drama is stripped away. We want catastrophe to begin where human intention is visible, at a siege, in a palace, on a notorious ship. We want a villain with a face, or at least a decision. Instead, what the evidence increasingly offers is a reservoir in the Tian Shan Mountains, a trading settlement near Lake Issyk-Kul, a sudden cluster of graves in 1338 and 1339, and then a commercial world efficient enough to do the rest by itself. No mastermind, no single opening scene, just ecology meeting infrastructure at the exact moment human systems had become too interconnected to fail gracefully. That, more than the corpse catapult story, is the real nightmare. Because it does not belong safely to the medieval past. It belongs to any age that confuses reach with control. Any age that pushes supply chains through landscapes it barely studies. Any age that assumes the center will see the true risk before the periphery feels it. Empires and markets are very good at measuring what moves through them when movement is profitable. They are much worse at seeing what else is hitching a ride. So the next time someone tells the Black Death as a simple European tragedy arriving from a vague China, or as a single biowarfare incident at Caffa, remember the stone by the lake. Remember the mountain reservoirs. Remember that one of history's greatest catastrophes did not begin where the loudest chronicles began. It began where commerce brushed against ecology and failed to notice the terms of the encounter. And that is the broader lesson here. Power usually believes disaster will announce itself in the language power understands. Diplomatic warnings, military reports, treasury shortfalls, visible unrest. But some of the most expensive shocks in history begin in the margins, in systems nobody glamorous was watching closely enough, until the bill arrives at the center all at once. The Black Death was one such bill. Its invoice was written in mortality, labor scarcity, confiscated certainty, and centuries of recurring plague. Its true origin was not a legend. It was a location, a reservoir, and a network. If one keyword from this story stays with you, let it be reservoir. Because that is where the illusion breaks, not at the walls of Caffa, not in a moral fable about East and West. At the point where human wealth touched a deeper biological world and assumed, fatally, that the road ran only one way. If that word changed how you think about history, leave reservoir in the comments. And if you come here for stories where money, empire, and catastrophe stop pretending to be separate subjects, subscribe. There are always more ledgers to read, and more ghosts hiding between the lines.